이번 심포지엄은 한국어와 영어 동시 통역이 제공됩니다. 줌 화면 아래에 통역 창을 누르시고 원하는 언어를 선택하시면 됩니다. 기조 강연자 분들을 포함한 오늘 발제와 토론을 맡아주실 분들이 끝까지 심포지엄에 함께할 예정입니다. 질문이 있으실 경우 채팅이 아닌 Q&A 창에 모든 토론자와 참석자를 선택하신 뒤 질문을 남겨주시면 이 세션 마지막 질의응답 시간에 답변을 드리겠습니다. 답변을 원하는 발제자와 토론자를 지정하시면 더욱 좋습니다. 보다 원활한 진행을 위해 발제와 토론이 진행되는 동안은 손들기 기능을 활용한 음성 질의는 받지 않으려고 하니 양해해 주시기 바랍니다. 실무진에게 문의사항이 있으신 경우에는 웨비나의 채팅창을 이용해 주시면 됩니다. 국내에서 처음으로 아동의 자유박탈이라는 주제로 개최되는 이번 국제심포지엄은 국가인권위원회, 국회 여성아동인권포럼, 국회의원 최기상, 국회의원 장혜영, 서울대학교 법학전문대학원 공익법률센터, 자유박탈아동 한국실무그룹에서 공동 주최하였습니다. 공동 주최 단위들은 3시간이라는 제한된 시간 동안 보다 실질적인 논의가 이루어지기를 바라는 마음으로 인사말은 자료집으로 대체하기로 결정했습니다. 자료집은 심포지엄이 종료된 이후 PDF 파일로 공유해 드릴 예정입니다. 온라인 중계 상황을 고려해 국민 의례와 애국가 제창 또한 생략하도록 하겠습니다. 바쁘신 와중에도 심포지엄에 함께 해주고 계신 여러분들께 진심으로 감사드립니다. 특히 한국의 자유박탈아동 실태조사에 참여해 귀한 의견을 남겨주신 아동 참여자와 이해관계자분들께 감사의 마음을 전합니다. 유엔에서 2016년 자유박탈 아동에 대한 국제연구 독립 전문가로 임명된 노박 맨프레드 교수님께서 이번 심포지엄을 축하하는 영상을 보내주셨습니다. 오늘 심포지엄에 노박 맨프레드 교수님을 포함한 유엔 자유박탈 아동 국제연구 연구진들이 지금 현재 모두 실시간으로 함께 참여하고 계십니다. 국제아동인권센터를 포함한 공동주최 단위들은 이 자리를 빌어 다시 한번 깊은 감사의 마음을 전합니다. 아쉽지만 시간 제약으로 인해 편집된 영상으로 함께 하려고 합니다. 교수님의 축하 영상 풀 버전은 국제아동인권센터 유튜브 채널에서 확인할 수 있습니다. 축하 영상을 함께 보시겠습니다. 한국어는 동시 통역으로 제공됩니다.
Hi, my name is Manfred Nowak. I am Professor of Human Rights at the University of Vienna in Austria, Secretary General of the Global Campus of Human Rights, which is based in Venice, Italy. And I have been appointed as independent expert leading the United Nations global study on children deprived of liberty. As you can see, it is a quite comprehensive book that was presented last year to the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York and also in Geneva. And in the meantime, we prepared a much shorter executive summary, which will be translated into the 5 other languages of the United Nations. Why do we need a global study? The Convention on the Rights of the Child is very, very clear. Detention of children can only be a measure of last resort. That means if there's really no other alternative. And then, if absolutely necessary, only for the shortest appropriate period of time. Now, the situation in reality looks totally different. There are millions of children in police custody, in prisons, in migration-related detention, in children's homes, in orphanages, in special institutions for children with disabilities, etc. But we simply don't know exactly how many children. UNICEF is always speaking about 1 million children, but that's primarily in the administration of justice. How many children are there in institutions deprived of liberty? We simply don't know. Migration-related detention. So the main purpose of the global study is to really take all available data in order to arrive at a scientifically sound conclusion about the number of children deprived of liberty in different settings and their fate. Depriving children of liberty is depriving them of childhood. It has a lasting effect on children who are in their formative stage, but also on society at large. A major activity is dissemination and follow-up to the global study on children deprived of liberty. As I said, one is already this executive summary, and now we have to go on to find people within our global campus to translate the executive summary in the Russian, Chinese, Spanish, French, and Arabic languages, but also organize further national and regional consultations in order to convince governments, with the assistance of UN agencies, non-governmental organizations, children's rights organizations, to really take the recommendations of the global study seriously, to develop plans of action in accordance with the Agenda 2013, with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And there's one goal that says, no more violence against children. To put children behind bars is a form of structural violence and needs to be abolished. To leave no one behind is the main message of the Agenda 2030. And we want the world to leave no child behind bars. Thank you.
오늘 심포지엄은 국제연구를 소개하는 세션 1과 한국의 현황을 살펴보는 세션 2로 구성되어 있습니다. 이제 본격적으로 첫 번째 세션, UN, 자유가 박탈된 아동 국제연구를 시작하겠습니다. 첫 기조강연을 맡아주실 분은 전 UN 인권 특별 보고관이자 자유박탈아동 국제연구의 전문가위원으로 참여하신 비티트 문타본 교수님입니다. 지금 태국에서 함께 해주고 계신데요. 자유박탈아동 독립전문가 맨프레드 노박이 주도한 2019년 UN 국제연구의 시사점이라는 주제로 강연을 요청드리겠습니다. 발표 시간은 최대 25분으로 부탁드리겠습니다. 그럼 교수님을 화면으로 모시고 화면을 공유해 주시기 바랍니다.
Hello, everyone. 안녕하세요. Hello, everyone in Korea. Good afternoon from Bangkok. And I'm sitting in my little office at the Faculty of Law, Chulalongkorn University. It's a pleasure and an honor to participate in this web conference. And I'm also very happy and very grateful to have been asked to participate as a reader advisor of the global study that you've been hearing about. And what I would like to do is to summarize the global study of our dear friend, Professor Manfred Novak, and offer a few comments as well from my perspective of someone on board for a period of time in terms of the preparation of the report. And then I have also various questions from you, which I look forward to answer later. So what I will do now is present in a short period of time the PowerPoint, and then you're welcome to send in more questions and so on. But some have already come in, and I will answer to these questions a little bit later after hearing our friend from DCI. The global study of Professor Manfred, which was prepared with great cooperation globally, including with inputs from children, covers 6 areas of concern. And behind all this, if you'd like a little bridge, it's really to do with how governments, through their institutions, have been detaining children or depriving children of liberty. Because when we talk about human rights, at least we talk about advocacy towards the government in regard to its practices. So this is the starting point as to why we're covering these 6, which are very much linked with government-related institutions. Number 1, detention in administration of justice, in prison, in hostels, in observation centers run by governments. Number 2, children in prisons with primary caregivers. Maybe the mother has done something wrong, so the child is with her, and the question is, should the child be there for a long period? Or the father? And what about facilities for the father? Thirdly, migration-related detention, and this is a big issue globally, which you read about on all continents, to do with refugee children, asylum-seeking children, sometimes coming by themselves, landing up in immigration detention or the equivalent. Fourthly, deprivation of liberty in institutions, a variety of institutions that were mentioned already by Professor Novak. Maybe a children's home, which is a closed home, or a hospital, which is closed, or a mental facility, which is also closed, run by the government. So these are all to be looked at in terms of how the child is not able to leave without the child's consent, without the consent of the official, so to speak, and bear in mind the child's own consent. Fifth, detention in the context of armed conflict. Very difficult in warfare. While children are sadly used and abused in war, sometimes kept, detained, abused accordingly, very sadly. And finally, the 6th one is on national security grounds, as linked with situation of terrorism or other forms of violence which interlink with national security. The context of the preparation of the report is very much based upon various linchpins, including the right to personal liberty of the child, bearing in mind the importance of views of children with the impact on health, and now, of course, COVID-19, we have to bear in mind very much, which came after the report was finished, but which we'll have to look at in terms of Q&A. Children with disabilities and gender dimension, and I worked on the gender dimension particularly for this study. The methodology is an interesting one too, and the methodology is much linked with questionnaires sent to some 67 states, generally to many states, but 67 replied with 100 replies all over. We have also administrative records from state agencies and figures from UN and other sources. And this document, the study, is full of statistics which were very difficult to collect and to collate. And for all types of deprivation of liberty, samples were gathered from 69 to 137 states, except in the context of armed conflict, which had a smaller grouping, and in regard to national security. And from these initial data, through various methodologies, computation, regression models, various types of data disaggregated were produced ultimately, which are borne in mind and which are elaborated upon in the study. The consultations in preparation took part in all parts of the globe with views of children from 22 states, and I'll reply to some questions on children's views later, because this has been one of the areas of interest from those preparing for this conference. The starting point is the CRC, the Child Rights Convention, and the child is referred to here under 18 as the criterion. And yet a very important issue is what should be the minimum age of criminal responsibility under which the child should not be dealt with by the criminal justice system, and under which the child should not have criminal records, which will label the child, stamp with a certain taboo for the rest of his or her life. And the current criterion is age of criminal responsibility should not be under 14, but we have a variety at the national level. In Thailand, my country, it's 10, which is far too low. And we've for a long time been working on pushing it up, but we've not succeeded yet. We bear in mind the best interest of the child as a principle from CRC and found in all countries. And very importantly, the key article 37b, which enunciates the right and principle that deprivation of liberty of children shall only be a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time. That is the very key principle. And you can see the whole text there. Read it again, but I've summarized it for you already in terms of 37b. Let's look at the 6 groups. For children in the admin of justice, particularly in detention, it's estimated about 200,000 children in remand centers and prisons worldwide every day, and at least 410,000 in prison and remand annually. And one problem is criminalization of various activities, which are not criminal if an adult does it, but which are criminalized, where a child does it. For example, truancy, walking on the streets in certain hours. It's not generally a crime for adults to do so, but it is a crime in many countries if the child is playing truant on the streets when supposedly the child should be at school. And we have a problem with not enough use of non-custodial measures. Children are still locked up in detention all too easily and very sadly. Secondly, children living in prisons with primary caregivers. And it's approximated that about 19,000 children fall into this category every year. And this is linked to the fact that there's a lack of adequate prison facilities, and sometimes the mother or the father shouldn't be there at all. There's too much use of the incarceration facility. Some mothers and child have some access to facilities in prison to be together, but rarely, if at all, do we find this in regard to the father and the child if they're together in a prison. Generally, very few facilities, much less than for the mother and the child. But for them, that's not enough either. And there's not enough use of non-custodial measures, together with the need to respect family unity. Thirdly, migration-related detention, about 330,000 children estimated in this situation. Asylum seekers, allegedly classified as illegal immigrants on the border. There are always other measures that can be used for children in this situation, and they should not be in immigration detention at all. So the advocacy is to enable children to go to shelters and the like, and not to be detained at all, because there's always a possible option, alternative. Importantly, the family unity principle, sometimes in certain settings, there's a split between father and mother and child. Even if the child and the mother are out in shelter, the father is kept in immigration detention. And generally, there's not enough use of non-custodial measures. Fourthly, in regard to a variety of other institutions, maybe hospitals, closed hospitals, closed mental facilities, closed children's homes, a lot of children are estimated to be in these situations. And this affects children with disabilities, particularly mental disabilities as well. Several million are computed to be in these facilities, or were computed to be in these facilities at a certain period of time. And about 430,000 to 600,000 plus children are usually in these facilities annually. And there's a need to move towards enabling them to be in communities rather than in institutions, which are closed institutions usually. So the principle is to move towards de-institutionalization. Fifth, the question of armed conflict. About 35,000 children are computed to be in these situations, in a deprived situation. And we have to work with states and with non-government armed groups, or against them at times, to push them to release the children. Sadly, because at times the children are not only detained, but used and abused in warfare situations. And finally, on national security grounds, there are about 1,500 in 2018, according to stats of the report. And we have to be very careful with anti-terrorist legislation, which are at times overused, including against children, to lock them up. The reality is, therefore, according to the study, which came out a year ago, is that there are about 1 to 1.5 million children deprived of liberty, usually, at a given point in time, and computed annually. And there's not enough use of non-custodial measures, not enough deinstitutionalization. While we know as a principle that deprivation of liberty should be a last resort, and yet it is not a last resort in many situations. Deprivation of liberty is not a measure of last resort, even though it should be in many situations. Directions for the future include the move towards more diversion, diverting them from prisons, diverting them from closed facilities. So we advocate very much non-custodial measures linked with the best interest of the child and the other basic principles of the convention. There's also a need for adequate support for families and caregivers and communities to provide adequate care, appropriate care to children, to tackle root causes which are often linked with the family situation or the societal situation facing the child and the family. We also advocate that if there's a need to detain in particular cases, it should be in accordance with Article 37B, only for the shortest period, only for the shortest appropriate period. And fourthly, there's a need to move towards child-friendly conditions without discrimination, and this must be a state duty, state obligation. Importantly also, child participation as principle per Article 12 of the Child Rights Convention. Very important to listen to children, and we've done that with regard to this study. It's an empowering process if children are involved, and that helps to both prevent situations of a negative kind, as well as to protect children, as well as to provide solutions with due regard to peer examples, peer influence, and peer cooperation. And then the issue of data to map situations comes in very importantly, inviting us to respond well. And the study has tried very hard to provide samplings which are disaggregated and which are then generalized so as to provide you with an overview, which is what I've tried to do. Specific recommendations include the following. On administration of justice, there's a need to decriminalize, particularly in regard to status offenses, which are offenses where children are found to be criminal, so to speak, whereas the adult is not seen to be committing a crime. And there are many of these offenses concerned with so-called immoral deeds, which are classified as immoral when done by children, sadly. There's also a need for a minimum age of criminal responsibility, which should not be below the international standard of 14. And it's very important that we should not transfer children who reach 18 into or back to the criminal justice system of detention. Importantly also to enable police to work without exceeding 24 hours and not to impose capital and corporal punishment and life sentences. In regard to children in prisons with primary caregivers, non-custodial measures and individualized assessments are important. Provisioning also for parent-child. On migration-related children, a very clear position. Move children out of immigration detention and decriminalize their entry, as well as work for family unity and non-custodial care. On institutions, clear principle of deinstitutionalization, as well as to map institutions and work for options beyond institutions. On armed conflicts, finally, to target recovery and reintegration and not to detain or punish children while working with governments and non-government groups for accountability. And finally, on national security, to treat children as victims rather than terrorists and to use child-friendly juvenile justice systems accordingly. Additional considerations finally include gender. We found that there are more boys incarcerated than girls, and this is interesting, even though particular violent situations facing girls. The broader issue of gender diversity should not be forgotten. The study does not cover home situations, and we'll come to this in a moment, where there might be a deprivation of liberty. And the follow-up issue is one that we're still working on. What mechanisms should be taking over from Manfred? We're still working on that. So we use whatever's available, all the rapporteurs working on children at the moment. And finally, importantly, even though this is a global study waiting for some other UN inputs, we don't have to wait. We can take action at the national, local level now. for example, in Korea or in my country. We should not wait. Start at home, start in the community, respect child rights, use a whole of society approach, use well our resources, generate data, and with COVID-19, we call for more cooperation for child protection and child assistance. Leadership, good practices, child-sensitive actions, child-friendly facilities, all matter. I, you, us together. We can do together and recover better together. Thank you.
네, 발표 감사합니다. 아동의 자유가 박탈된 상황이 무엇을 의미하는지, UN 국제 연구가 시작된 배경과 연구 방법에서부터 실태와 개선 방향, 권고까지 꼼꼼하게 살펴주셨습니다. 나, 당신, 그리고 우리 모두가 함께라는 마지막 문장을 새기며 다음 발제로 넘어가려고 합니다. 다음으로 알렉스 카마라토스님께서는 아동의 자유 박탈과 시민사회의 역할이라는 주제로 두 번째 기조 강연을 발표해 주시겠습니다. 지금 스위스 제네바에서 함께 해주시고 계신데요. 알렉스 카마라토스님은 아동의 자유 박탈 문제를 세계적인 이슈로 선도한 국제 NGO인 Defense for Children International이라는 단체의 디렉터이면서 UN 자유박탈아동 국제연구를 위한 NGO 패널 공동위원장입니다. 발표 시간은 최대 25분으로 부탁드리겠습니다. 알렉스 디렉터님께서는 마이크를 켜고 PPT 화면을 공유해 주시기 바랍니다. 그럼 화면을 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I wanted to thank warmly the organizers for organizing this very important event from a long time ago, well before COVID, and for persisting in the actual happening of the event, even under these very difficult circumstances. As it was said, I'm here on my double capacity, first as Director of Defense for Children International, and I'm going to say a few words all the links we have with deprivation of liberty, so on the subject. And second, as co-chair of Defense for Children International, together with Human Rights Watch, of the NGO panel for the global study on children deprived of liberty, who, as you will see, supported the global study and is still working, a big coalition of NGOs. On this, let me put the presentation on full screen so that you can see it easier. I wanted to, in complementarity with the excellent presentation of Professor Vitit, to give you a little bit of background, because I think it's very important for the subject to know from where we come, where we are, and where we want to go in the future. I think it's something crucial before going to the very important issue of the concrete data in your country. First of all, a few words, as I said, for Defense for Children International, which is an international NGO created 40 years ago. We have three key words in our organization. So it's a membership base. So in fact, it has been created here in Geneva. But in fact, there are sections, national sections, so independent associations who are bearing the name of Defense for Children all over the world in 40 countries right now. They have their own structure. We share, of course, our strategy, our priorities, and the way of functioning. So it's a movement and a grassroots movement. So it's not a Nordic. We are here in Geneva as International Secretariat with a small team, but there are much bigger teams in the South, in Africa, in Latin America, in other countries of Europe. So it's not a pyramidal organization, but more a grassroots movement. And that's the key word. So membership-based, grassroots, and a movement. It was created in 1979, and the date, it's not a coincidence, as you know, the International Year of the Child. A lot of dynamics at this year and thinking about how to approach children, and it's the subject of today's also discussion, not only as from a charity point of view or humanitarian point of view, which has been done for many, many years, even previous centuries, but from a rights point of view and a rights-based approach. And that was, in fact, the reason of the creation of DCI in 1979, 41 years ago, advocating already for also a legally binding instrument, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which didn't exist. So very quickly, the first task of DCI was working for the convention. And in fact, DCI coordinated the NGO input to the negotiations of the convention, which took 2 years until 1989, the adoption. And that's why also our anniversaries are always connected with 10 years difference. So last year it was, as you know, the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the 40th anniversary of DCI with all these years. After the creation of the DCI, the adoption of the convention, what seemed to be very important for us was the implementation. Sometimes conventions, engagement from states, even if they are almost universal, as in the case of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, if they remain not applied in the field, it's not so much useful, basically. So our movement is since then working on the actual implementation and trying to find niche where there is need for more efforts from civil society to come in, to call on states, to give arguments, to go towards implementation of the study. And this is very much relevant, in fact, for our own discussion today. One of the overarching priorities of DCI, so identified as a place that civil society has a word to say and has to work together with other stakeholders for the implementation, is what we call justice for children, which remains the overarching priority today of DCI. And this is not only juvenile justice, which partly we are discussing today, but also beyond. It's a concept much wider. So how we can do justice for children, implementing their rights basically in every context and in every way. So it's a very wide concept beyond juvenile justice, but it goes, of course, in specific areas also of juvenile justice. Very quickly, the other areas, but again, to show you the complementarity with deprivation of liberty, is violence against children. And Professor Novak this morning mentioned it, as he always writes it, and mentioned very clearly that deprivation of liberty is a structural violence against children. It's a way of structural violence. So it's the link is absolutely clear. The third area is children on the move, or refugee children, children in the context of migration or internally displaced. And that also, we know that this is a chapter of the global study. And the fourth is children and armed conflicts, again, a chapter of the armed conflict. So it's not a surprise that deprivation of liberty all over the history of DCI has been a cross-cutting priority, formalized also I have put a few landmark years. So 1979, the creation of DCI, 89, the convention, 2006, and I'm going to cap later, the other global study, which was on violence against children, and it was mentioning already in 2006 deprivation of liberty. 2014, and I'm going to come into this in more details, the adoption of the resolution for a global study of children deprived of liberty by the UN General Assembly. 17, as I told you, that we formalized in DCI the strategy, and then 19, the delivery of the study. Just some landmarks, but I will come in more details on a few issues. So first of all, the first question which comes to our mind is why a global study, why this subject has been, as we said, this is the third study of this kind. There has been a first study on children in armed conflicts realized by Graça Machel, and a second one, as I just mentioned, on violence against children, realized by Sergio Pinheiro. Both studies were touching two subjects very related, but then since the beginning of DCI, we have realized that children deprived of liberty remains an invisible group for many reasons. Perhaps first of all, the issue is a little bit delicate. It's on state responsibility. Children that can be detained. Perhaps also an issue that we don't want to speak publicly on what's happening in our own country from some governments. And the second is very objective issue. Why we needed a global study was that it was a clear lack of quantitative and qualitative data, particularly disaggregated data. Not enough research, verified information on the situation of children deprived of liberty. Although the definition was clear from the international instruments and from the convention. So in 1986, that's a few years after the creation of DCI already launched a big book at the time, which was entitled, and you can still find it, I'm sure, on internet and in media, Children in Adult Prisons, and it was written by Katarina Tomaszewski, which brought a first study on covering 28 countries and the data on deprivation of liberty, in particular of children that are in prison with adults at the time. And that was, at the time, it was something very novel because there have not been many research, etc. 1989, the convention came. Professor Vitit mentioned, and I don't come again, to the definition also of in particular, the wording of Article 37B, which is so important. The two reports, the previous global studies, so Grasa Macher's report and also the report of Sergio Pineiro on violence are mentioning deprivation of liberty and giving some data on institutions also where violence against children is an issue. These studies at the UN level, they are coming to an area where there is a need for particular attention. That's why, in fact, in 2014, we came in the conclusion that we need to come to a new study, a third study of this kind, the global study on children deprived of liberty, who are particularly exposed on risks of abuse, of violence, as it was explained, acute social discrimination, denial of their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And that's something very important. In terms of violence, there was also something new in the last 10 years, because you know that neurosocial sciences have done an enormous progress. And some of the things that we were already suspecting or arguing about the impact of deprivation of liberty to a brain of a child who is growing, it was proved scientifically by neurosciences in the last years, and that's very. So it's another argument that came very objectively and scientifically without just so to speak human rights arguments. And the third one was that the study, once established now, this more than 750 pages, it's lengthy. It comes also with a lot of data that we were missing. It can serve as a benchmark for future progress, because how we can say that we want to eliminate the deprivation of liberty of children, but how we can measure and monitor progress in this area if we don't have a concrete reference. And that's also the starting point of a global study. Together with Professor Novak and the advisory committee, the NGO panel, we say the work starts now. Now we have this data, this beginning of collection of data. We can start implementing the content, the recommendations, the good practices. So that was also something very important. So in 2014, we came to this conclusion that we need, it was a right moment. So it was DCI, but of course, we know that when there is such a big movement to do, we don't do it all alone. We are reaching out to other partners. Very quickly, we had a good partnership which still is active today with Human Rights Watch as a co-chair. We formed this NGO panel on a coalition, if you want, of NGOs working for the global study at the time. When we started the first year in 2014, there were around 40 NGOs that joined forces to advocate. At the time, we were advocating for a UN resolution to ask for the global study. And indeed, so the 40 NGOs today, they have become 170 NGOs all over the world in the NGO panel, so it has been grown. And in 2014, there were a few months, not so many, up to the autumn, as usually October is the third committee of the UN General Assembly, where we managed to go through a resolution which is asking the Secretary General to commission a study on a global study on children deprived of liberty. So that was in December 14, voted officially, and it was a fact. So that was a first victory, if you want, not for the NGOs, but for the issue of deprivation of liberty. And then, of course, the next step was the nomination of the experts, and that, as always at the UN, there are some procedures that take a lot of time. So in October 2016, it was the official nomination of the independent expert, and we were so happy because also he was nominated with the support also of the NGO society, well known with his career and professionalism and expertise. Professor Manfred Novak was nominated, and from there we started the work. So I have put just in this slide the landmarks of this since 2014. So 2014, as we mentioned, the alliance, the formalization of the NGO panel. Then in December, the adoption of the resolution. In October, the nomination of Professor Manfred Novak as independent expert. I always recall in November, we had the first dinner here in Geneva discussing, so excited all together on how we can proceed. Also a bit conscious already of difficulties, and the difficulties came quite quickly because from the next year we realized what we knew already, that the resolution, of course, was positive, asking the Secretary General to commission. Then the expert was nominated, but there was a small sentence within the resolution saying that this study will be funded on a voluntary basis. And you know from your experience that at the UN, financial issues are very delicate, are very difficult. And we came to the situation where there was not enough funding, basically, to do the study. So 17, 18 in particular has been a year very, very difficult, where the NGO civil society also came back and said, we are going to have it, we need this study. It was a period I recall that very good friends of ours, even members of the committee and other experts supporting the idea, were saying, but is it possible to do it finally if nobody is funding? We had just a bunch of governments, Switzerland, Austria, very, very few funding compared to the budget needed to do it correctly. Despite that, we continued. It was the year in 2018 in spring that we, together with the advisory committee, Professor Novak, the civil society, came to finalize a questionnaire. This was the basis of the collection of data for the global study. So this questionnaire was sent out to all the governments of the members of the United Nations through the embassies here in Geneva, again to the capitals. There was also, and that's very important also for the future, It was Professor Novak also, I think, insisted a lot to have a snapshot day for a census. So of course the data were collected for a year, 2018, but he was saying, and we are still saying, also supporting a civil society, that it is good not only for the past but every year that governments have a sense, a kind of sense or a snapshot of what are the children deprived of liberty in all the categories that Professor Vitit presented, that are deprived of liberty in your own country, and on this to compare from year to another. And then, the initial plan of 2 years had to be postponed with all these difficulties to 2019. But the important thing is that with all the contributions, including from civil society, from academic world, and very important, from the committee itself, and the advisory committee was chaired by Professor Anne Skelton from South Africa, who is excellent in this area and supported a lot. The chairs, the different chairs of the committee, Renate Winter in particular at that time, who was the chair. So all this support made it happen, and we are so happy about it. In October, it was launched to the United Nations. And in November, it was launched the full study. So in the United Nations, there is still available the kind of summary of the study in the form of a UN document translated in all the UN languages. And then in November, the full study was launched here at the same time as the anniversaries for the 30th of the United Nations and the 40th of DCI, as we said. So we are now in 2020, and we start under difficult circumstances with COVID-19, and we are going to come back to this because it's difficult circumstances. At the same time, it's an environment who shows another time how important it is to work in this area of the children deprived of liberty. A very quick word on why a holistic approach, because it's something that has been debated in diplomatic areas and academic. Some people were saying, why you're not doing strict censor detention, and why you go to a more holistic approach. And that's something very important. Because deprivation of liberty, also as we defined in DCI, is something that goes beyond administrative detention. Also, in order to collect the data, which was one of the purposes of the study, you have this holistic approach, which is absolutely compatible and now confirmed by the international instruments, the Covenant on Human Rights, the general comments, etc., the convention itself, and delimiting into just administrative detention, it wouldn't be correct. In terms of data, we were trying to go beyond this generic statement. In 2017, around 17 and 19, UNICEF came with a statement that there should be around 1 million children deprived of liberty. So this big figure, but global and covering only administration of justice, basically. But we wanted to be more concrete, more precise, and that was the purpose also of this holistic approach. So that's a bit the way you see deprivation of liberty in DCI, covering violence, covering justice for children, children armed conflict, and children on the move. And in the global study, as Professor Vitit presented, we have the different areas, so administration of justice, but also migration, but also children living with their caregivers, children in institution, armed conflict, and context of national security. And then the other cross-cutting situation of these children, so the health, access to health, the child participation, disabilities, and gender. And all this was a holistic approach to deprivation of liberty, and that's very important for the methodology and for the future to have this approach. Now, with this subject as a holistic approach, we also needed a multi-stakeholder process, and it was the way it was conceived and undertaken. Of course, at the top, there was the UN General Assembly, who was the Secretary General. The Secretary General nominated a UN task force, which was led, and it's still led because it still exists for the follow-up of the study, by the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, today Najat Malamjid and Marta Santos Pais at that time. And this task force has a very important role to coordinate all the UN agencies that are concerned with deprivation of liberty of children. And of course, there is UNICEF, but there is, as you can see on the top of the screen, the UNODC, IOM, UNHCR, the Agency on Refugees, WHO, at the Human Rights Office, of course, here in Geneva. Yes, the other SRG, CAC, the CRC, etc. So this task force has been very important in the terms of UN coordination. So the independent expert with his team had an advisory board, and which was chaired by Anne Skelton. The NGO panel was also represented there by DCI and Human Rights Watch. And then there was a whole team of coordination by chapter that was following the research, the data, the recommendations. Professor Novak was not all alone, but it was a really joint venture, and that's something we pay tribute to him, because he coordinated this so well, and he was so inclusive in associating all the actors. These groups, the research groups, they did, of course, a review of relevant legal framework. They used the data of the questionnaire. Unfortunately, as you saw, the questionnaire, it went to all member states, but only a little bit more than 1/3 of the countries responded. So the data had to be completed. And in the book, you find this list, which is a very complete list of all the responses from states. And that's the dark blue. So those were states who responded to the questionnaire, and then from other actors like NGOs or civil society or national human rights institutions. If you go into the details, you will see that Korea is not there, unfortunately. But today, with your event, it's very important that you are one of the first countries where you work on the implementation. And we thank you for this. It's very important. 12 thematic regional consultations. Also, this was scheduled, but it has to take regional approaches. There was no funding. So what did we do? NGOs supported the process, other organizations and so on. As DCI, we organized a meeting in Africa on justice for children. And together with that, we did a regional consultation in Ethiopia for the African countries. There were the 9 research groups. So you can see here all the groups are working together to produce this study. So 3 expert meetings, 12 national, regional, thematic meetings, 118 questionnaires from different origins, of course, 9 research groups, including also a children consultation with 274 children. And that's very important, because child participation had to take place also for the writing of this study, and that was a challenge. I don't come into the details of the figures, but it's something very important to take into account on what Professor Vitit presented so well. When we went in New York and they sent us they were the first release of information on data, some states were saying, it's only 1.5 million. Already it's a shocking statement, because 1.5 million children, it's a lot. But then what we explained to governments at the time, because they were comparing 1.5, UNICEF was saying 10 years ago or more that there were around 1 million. So basically it's not so big. But the issue is much more important, because Professor Novak explained several times that the mandate of the study was to see and to evaluate, first to have only verified data, second, limiting the data on the jure deprived of liberty. What does this mean? All the lawyers, they know that the jure means those who are children who are deprived of liberty as a consequence of an official legal decision, be it a justice decision or administrative decision, for institutions, for instance, or whatever, but an official decision. But the reality, and that's something also that Professor Novak explained, is that there are de facto children deprived of liberty, where the figure is beyond 7 million. So it's an estimate you can see here, 7.2 million, and there is a breakdown by category of children per year. So that means also from the snapshot point of view, and that every year this number is repetitive, that are deprived of liberty. So the figures are huge, and that explains, now give us even more arguments to work on this subject. You could see also the issue on institutions, that in the institutions part, the difference between de facto and de jure, it's huge, because you have 5.4 million de facto, and only if I can say 670,000 de jure. So that means that in many countries the children are deprived of liberty in the context of institutions, that it's not linked to a decision and formal decision. Now I come to our subject, and I'm going to finish soon because my time is soon over. So what was the role of the civil society? In a few words, I think you understood already. First, our role was to make it happen. Professor Novak was saying several times, without DCI, this study would have never happened. And I would say without the civil society in general, because we never worked all alone. We worked as joining forces, complementarities areas. We make it happen, and we were there to believe in it when the people start saying it would have been nice, but it won't happen. Second, we have been an integral part of contributing. So in the 5 research groups, each of us dividing forces, we were in the administration of justice, other were in migration and so on. We were actively contributing with data, trying to cover gaps that were not covered, debates on recommendations and so on. So we were there during the writing of the report. And again, thanks to Manfred Novak for giving us this opportunity. And then continuing advocacy on this issue, which has to come now, and we need to follow up. So there is a key role now after the study for the dissemination, for awareness raising, for doing what you are doing, doing today, saying that for a government, it's not only on the best interests of the child, but it's also, if I can say, on the best interests of governments to build on the recommendations and alternatives to deprivation of liberty, instead of building wards and prisons for children. So we need to mainstream this global study now, these 750 pages, but there is, as Professor Novak explained, now a shorter version for those who want to go quickly. So we need to lobby, but in a good sense, to give arguments, to disseminate, to create, as you have started doing now in Korea, national focal points, where we recommend that there is a civil society, national institutions, and the government designated with a focal point from one ministry coordinating the other ministries, because it's a cross-cutting issue. And then going to a tailored implementation in each country, because you are not concerned, or every country is not concerned by all the sectors, or has to give priorities, etc. Challenge the policies and legislations that allow children still to be to have the easy solution to close them, lock them down. And then the other thing that we give priority now, right now, is to find an international mechanism to follow up the study. We know from the experience of the previous studies, in particular the Gasha Machel and the one on violence, that you need an international also mechanism to monitor and continue this effort. In the previous study, as you know, there has been one special representative of the Secretary General nominated, one from Children in Armed Conflict and one from Children and the Fight Against Violence Against Children. We know that with the financial situation today in the UN and globally, this is very difficult, but we are trying to find alternatives, in particular working with existing institutions and special representatives of Secretary General, the 2 special representatives, but in particular the one on children, violence against children. So I think I would like to finish with the words that Professor Novak repeats very much. children deprived of liberty are deprived of their childhood. We should act now and stop deprivation of the liberty and deprivation of childhood of a child. Share the figures that gives you the idea of the dimension of this problem and the practices. So invest in childhood, not in prison, and then create synergies, work together at the national, regional, and international level. And that's very important, that each level cross-fertilizes and supports the implementation of the study. I'm sharing with you the website that we have, the DCI website, defenseforchildren.org, but also a specific website we have when you can find the study itself. You can download it free. You can download the executive summary. So it's very easy, childrendeprivedofliberty.info. The social media that are now working, disseminating also this event and giving to other countries ideas on how they can proceed on dissemination. And on this, I would like to thank you very much. And I will come back also later to respond to numerous questions, and with a lot of pleasure. Thank you so much.
네, 발표 감사합니다. DCI가 있었기 때문에 저희가 오늘 이 자리에 설 수 있지 않았나 싶습니다. 자유박탈 아동이라는 국제 연구가 왜 필요한지, 이 연구를 시작하기 전과 그 이후를 구분해서 시민사회 역할에 대해서 구체적으로 발표해 주셨습니다. 지금 제네바 시간으로 새벽 6시임에도 불구하고 오늘 이제 함께 해주고 계신데요. 풍성한 강연해 주셔서 감사합니다. 긴 시간 동안 고생 많으셨습니다. 기조 강연 해주시는 분들께서 시간을 잘 지켜주셔서 저희가 예정된 시간보다 조금 더 쉴 수 있게 되었습니다. 한국 시간으로 3시 20분부터 두 번째 세션을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 두 번째 세션은 장혜영 국회의원님의 진행으로 진행될 예정이니 3시 20분부터 또 함께 해주시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다.